and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is Massachusetts TNC's webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Allison Bowden, TNC in Massachusetts, Director of Rivers, Coasts, and Oceans, and your host for today. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally, using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and the planet. We have an exciting program for you today. We'll be chatting about how a group of partners, including the Museum of Science and Northeastern University, are collaborating on a NOAA-funded project that brings community-generated data into local resilience planning through visualization and deliberation. This work is being done at 28 science centers across the country. You'll hear from David Sittenfeld and Dr. Brian Helmuth about how educators at these sites are working with local resilience planning partners to engage their community members in active learning, data collection, and decision-making about natural hazards and about potential solutions to those challenges. After you hear from David and Brian, you'll get the chance to ask them your questions. But first, a little about our guests. David Sittenfeld is manager of the Forum program at the Museum of Science in Boston, which engages citizens, policymakers, and scientists in deliberative conversations around emerging scientific and technological issues. In addition to overseeing the museum's Forum program, David regularly gives talks on topics in current science and technology at the museum. He delivers demonstrations in the exhibit halls and manages special programs and exhibit projects. Dr. Brian Helmuth is a professor at Northeastern University in the Department of Marine and Environmental Sciences and the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. His research focuses on predicting the likely ecological impacts of climate change on coastal ecosystems and on the development of products that are scientifically accurate, understandable, and useful by a diverse array of stakeholders. Thanks again so much for joining today. David and Brian, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Allison. And on behalf of myself and David, thank you to all the people on the call today for joining us today. David, if you could throw up the slides, please. As we continue to see the ongoing impacts of climate change, I guess the next one, please, David. Thanks. So as we continue to see the ongoing effects of climate change, like heat waves, there's really an increasing understanding that we need not just mitigation approaches to reduce carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, but also to adapt to the changes we're already seeing. We've seen that in recent times in the Boston area in a series of heat waves and in the number of billion-dollar disasters all across the US and across the globe. There are also very deep connections that we'll explore today about how we look at climate resilience and climate adaptation in the context of social, racial, and environmental justice, and a recognition that the most vulnerable people are also those who are least able to adapt. And so as a result, we have to find solutions that involve deep connections with the stakeholders being impacted in co-developing strategies. Could I have the next slide, please, David? So as part of this, what's interesting as an academic scientist is there's really been a tectonic shift in how academic researchers think about this. In a lot of ways, it's becoming a lot more in line with the way that organizations like the Nature Conservancy have been doing it for a long time, where we're moving away from what we're kind of calling the loading dock model, where the way we view this, to be honest, is that science would collect objective information. We then deliver it to the public, and as part of our broader impacts part of our research would translate that work to stakeholders. And then the assumption is that stakeholders would then dutifully use that information based on best available science. And it would be very unidirectional. Next slide, please, David. Now where we're at, and again, TNC has been doing this for a while, is more of a co-development model. So rather than science acting alone and handing information, it's the needs of stakeholders that inform the way we do science to begin with. Now, that doesn't mean that the opinions of the public inform objective facts. We still are using objective facts. Climate change is still climate change, regardless of whether people believe in it or not. But more often than not, what we do with those facts, what we do with the scientific information is more dependent on the priorities and perceptions of stakeholders than it is on the science that's being done. And so this co-development strategy where there's this constant back and forth, where the needs and perceptions of stakeholders inform the science that's being done, the products that are being delivered, and ultimately what the decision support tools are that are enacted in the communities, has really become the focus of a lot of academic research. And a lot of that is what you'll hear about today. Next slide, please, David. A big piece of this, especially in the last year with Black Lives Matter, is recognition that this has to be done in an equitable way. And that if we just think of it in terms of equality, that we have resources available to everyone equally, that's not the same as recognizing that there are historic and current inequities that have to be overcome to make that playing field level. And so I really like this diagram because it outlines the difference between equality and equity, and then the reality of where it is now, which is totally inequitable. This really plays out very deeply in a lot of ways with climate change. Next slide, please, David. Where we know that climate change is a threat multiplier. It is always interacting with other stressors, which are more likely than not to be inequitable in their distribution as well. So one example of that is extreme heat, as you'll hear from a minute in David, tended to hit communities during heat waves that were also disproportionately susceptible to COVID-19. And so climate change is always interacting with all these other stressors that too have historic and current inequities. So I'm going to pass it over to David next to talk about the strategy that we've been taking, and then I'll come back a little bit later and talk about some of the visualizations we've done.
Thank you so much, Brian, for setting the table for this work that we're going to be talking about. And I just want to reiterate this idea that because of the societal context for climate resilience planning and climate action planning, there's this need that's been well identified for a long time to involve community members from all areas and parts of a community in the sort of visioning of what those communities can do to become more resilient and have agency. And this idea of involving community members in policymaking is by no means new. This is now over 50-year sort of very, very influential paper that came out from Sherry Arnstein called The Ladder of Citizen Participation. And what we're targeting here is the idea of actually giving community members some modicum of control, not only of what will happen, but what of our communities will be like, how they can be more equitable and just better places by virtue of their perspectives and ideas being included in this kind of work. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see a picture from the NOAA Office of Education's recently issued Theory of Change for Resilience Education. And it really reflects this idea of communities being more resilient, but also more equitable places by bringing their ideas to the beginning, as we heard Brian just talk about. And we've been lucky to be able to work on a national project that Allison mentioned in the introduction that was supported by NOAA. It's actually been funded by 2 consecutive NOAA environmental education grants that has allowed people to engage regular community members from all walks of life in doing this kind of resilience planning about 4 environmental hazards that I'll talk about. And the project is called Citizen Science, Civics, and Resilient Communities. And as part of that, we've developed this framework that we call the Science to Civics process that I'll go into now. And it has these sort of 3 components that you see here: community science, public forums and resilience planning and decision making that we've kind of mapped to the policy cycle. And the idea is that if we think about that latter, that we can engage community members in as many parts of that sort of policy implementation part as possible, so that their voices are well represented and we have their local knowledge and perspectives. So as mentioned, we have this project that's led by the Museum of Science and Northeastern University, along with a number of partners that you can see here representing national expertise from public engagement, citizen science, and science policy, that is working with community and civic partners in each of these 28, 30 locations to build community engagement and inform local resilience planning around the 4 hazards of drought, extreme precipitation, sea level rise, and extreme heat. I won't go into too much of the details, but I do want to show you a little bit of how that's playing out. So what you can see here is a map and where the 4 hazards are happening. So each of these sites has created a campaign that brings people together to do these 3 activities of community science, public deliberation, and resilience planning all together. And you can see that, by hazard, they're just sort of dispersed around the country. And when we wrote the grant, we thought the events were going to be like what you see on the bottom. Our first NOAA project allowed us to have these in-person deliberations where people got together and deliberated for hours on these questions. But it ended up being more like the picture that you see at the top. So that's Max Colley from our colleagues at the Museum of Life and Science, who have really taken this and innovated in COVID times, having to come up with ways of encouraging people to have conversations and then do those conversations and connect them with community science activities. And at the end of our talk, we'll share how you can participate in virtual forums that we're convening across these sites. Our first national event was on sea level rise and took place last night. We'll send you the link for the other ones. But what do these people do? Well, the idea is that participants at each of these locations will do these 5 things. They'll collect and analyze data through participatory science around a specific hazard that's relevant to their community. And that hazard and the focus for it has been selected in collaboration with local resilience planners and community partners, so that it reflects the priorities of civic planners and of engaged communities. And they learn about these vulnerabilities through visualizations of the geospatial data that are created by the community science, but also by all of the resilience planning that has happened until that point. I'm going to talk primarily about this participatory data collection and analysis, and you'll be hearing from Brian later on about the subsequent parts of the process, which are deliberative problem solving, the design of community resilience plans, accounting for diverse perspectives that are brought forward, and then presenting these recommendations to resilience planners and the public so they can help be part of the resilience planning process. I will just echo something that Brian said, which is that we know that groups like the Nature Conservancy and a lot of the folks in the public health and planning worlds have been doing this work for a really long time. So we didn't have to push this process on these communities. It's there already. And really, we had to learn from them and figure out how to do it under the auspices of this kind of environmental education. So it's really been more learning on our part and sort of leveraging the knowledge that is in these communities already. And so I want to begin with this idea of community science. And the agenda setting step for that begins with the selection of a locally focused and relevant citizen science project or participatory science project that connects to these resilience planning priorities. And the idea is that hopefully that these agenda setting decisions for what will be addressed are made with input from the local resilience planners and community stakeholders. And what happens is that these community science volunteers are recruited in partnership with these folks with particular focus, as Brian said, upon the communities that are most vulnerable to these climate impacts and is historically stigmatized by scientific institutions, so that their ideas are well represented. And so what these volunteers do is they contribute observations through apps or projects like My Coast, which allows people to document flooding, or Icy Change, which allows people to kind of document changes in their environment, or using sensors. I'm going to talk about our project that you can see in the picture here, but there are any number of different projects that our partners are using, from digital things that are almost like online journaling during climate change events, to really participating in the actual collection of very hyper-local data through projects that were already created. And we've been really lucky to work with a group called SciStarter. If you don't know about it, you should check it out. It's a very large global citizen science community that matches people who want to participate in these projects to all kinds of projects around the world. And so I'm going to focus in on a heat mapping campaign that we conducted last summer, but we're doing this with all of the hazards that I described earlier. So some of you may have heard about these campaigns that are popping up around the country through the support of NOAA Climate Office and a group called Kappa Strategies, which is an outgrowth of Portland State University and the work of Dr. Vivek Shandas. We were part of this in 2019 and actually are doing it again in the Mystic River watershed here in the Northeast, and we called it Wicked Hot Boston. My colleague Max Colley, who I mentioned earlier, is leading a team in North Carolina who's doing so this summer. I'm not sure when their mapping date is. I can try to find out that for you. There are many other communities that have done this in cities and will be doing so this summer and beyond. I learned recently that, so you can see this raster field, this sort of modeled heat map that Brian showed you a version of before that came out of this participatory science. If we do this enough, I guess the idea is that we actually could have a high-res modeled 10 by 10 resolution heat map that would cover the continental United States and have hyper-local vulnerabilities well characterized at a block level. And of course, we know this is important because extreme heat is the silent storm, right? It kills more Americans each year than floods, earthquakes, or tornadoes, with particular impacts upon low-income populations and people of color. And we know that with the projected increase in the number of very hot days, you can see this graphic from here in Boston, our Climate Ready Boston report from the city. Here in Boston, our summers are projected to become more like places like Washington, D.C., where I grew up, or even Birmingham, Alabama in the last century. And I don't think I have to belabor this point because anyone who's been looking at these heat events in the western part of our country know that this has huge impacts on public health and on infrastructure. And there are big uncertainties about how we're going to deal with that. So to help characterize these hyperlocal community vulnerabilities, we implemented a community science project to map urban heat islands. And we worked closely with city planners in Boston, Cambridge, and Brookline, where 50 community scientists participated in urban heat island mapping over multiple days, driving routes around at multiple times in the day to produce transects that were ended up feeding into a machine learning algorithm and creating this very high resolution community generated data set. And what you can see on the left-hand side of the screen are the 10 transects that were driven by these community scientists. And as mentioned, we're going to go further out through our subsequent work this summer with our partners. But we can see the huge disparities in what people are experiencing at a given time. What you actually are looking at here is 3 p.m. And what we found is that the maximum temperature measured during this route was
David, I think your slides dropped off.
Oop, hello?
I think your slides dropped off, David. Sorry.
The slides go away. Hold on. Let me see if I can get them back. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can get them back. I apologize. Are they back, Brian?
You're good.
Okay, sorry about that. So we saw that the maximum temperature was 102 degrees Fahrenheit with a heat index of 108 degrees Fahrenheit in an environmental justice community called Ashmont. And that was much warmer than the official recording station at the same time of 92 degrees Fahrenheit and 15 degrees warmer from the coolest measured area. You can see some of those areas in green. And so this gives us a sense of how people are experiencing these heat waves and how we can bring the perspectives and ideas from the people who helped characterize those data to local communities. I just quickly want to zoom in for one moment and say that the idea is that these data sets not only tell you where it's hot, but what those places are like, and they can be used for community planning. And the high resolution nature of these data mean that the people who help collect them can tell you about these neighborhoods. They can tell you, what is the sort of reality on the ground of the urban morphology, but although the history. And we've been hearing a lot, we know, about the sort of legacy of redlining. Our colleagues, Jeremy Hoffman from the Science Museum of Virginia and their co-authors at Portland State, who are the same people who developed developed this method for the high resolution heat mapping, got a lot of attention the last year because they published this data in the Journal of Climate that compared redlining data with heat in 108 cities. And that made us want to delve into the findings from our own air temperature mapping here in Boston. I won't spend too much time on it, but what we found is that there were statistically significant increases in terms of the temperatures that we saw in the areas that were categorized as declining or hazardous, compared with those that were rated as good or desirable under these discriminatory policies of the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s. So these areas have persisting differences in temperature of sometimes 2, 3, 4 degrees on average, which make it much more difficult for these communities to withstand the heat impacts and health impacts of a heat wave at night. They just don't cool off as much. And this is likely because of the land use dimension of this. Here you can see that the amount of impervious surface in these formerly redlined areas, which are labeled as D, is upwards of 75% with a mean of 66% of these hard impervious surfaces, compared with a much lower number in the areas. And this also connects to tree cover. We found that in areas that have this, cooler places that were not redlined, there's a lot more tree cover. And the good news, right, is that this is a planning decision that can be dealt with now. And this is why it's so important to consult communities and have them think about equitable solutions, because planting trees has its own, decisions connected to it about land use, and it's important to think about this. So just very quickly to talk about how the data are being used, these outcomes have been included in updates to the City of Boston and other communities' climate adaptation reports and been used by decision makers around the region. And the city planners have been very excited to play around with the data. And the first way that we presented the results of these data was at a deliberative forum event in Boston called Wicked Hot Boston, where we brought together the civic planners from our community and civic partners to share the data and then put it into an exercise where participants made recommendations about how to keep communities cooler and about social equity. So now I'm going to pass it back to Brian, who's going to talk about what these deliberations are like and how we facilitate these kinds of conversations.
Great, thanks, David. So the next step in this process then is to use the information collected by the community scientists to inform visualizations. As David said, we have these series of interactive games that are led by experts that we use to engage community scientists as well as additional people. I mean, as David said earlier, lately a lot of this has been in over Zoom, but prior to the pandemic, we would bring together people in groups as large as 100 or more, put them in tables of 6 to 8 people, and then guide them in these deliberations about climate hazards and about solutions to those. We tried as best as we could to recruit from a wide range of demographics, of ages, income levels, races, education levels, so that we could get as many people to the table from as many different lived experiences as we could. Next slide, please, David. So the way we explore these, and it was really fortuitous that right before COVID hit, we had already started transitioning to this online version to ease it, the ability to share across different sites. And so we started using ArcGIS story maps, where if anybody has seen these before, they're an interactive framework that you can use multimedia to let people explore at their own pace and not follow a set path. We did try as best we could then to follow the steps to resilience by the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, where we allowed people to explore the threats, to assess vulnerabilities and risks, how those differed among different community members, look at options, and then based on priorities and perceptions, prioritize actions, and then ultimately, as David will talk about, use the input from stakeholders to take action by working with community leaders. Next slide, please. As David said, we had 4 different threats: extreme heat, extreme precipitation, drought, and sea level rise. We created a series of fictional communities that were based on real communities. We had run a pilot study where we used real communities, but we found that people zoomed in so much on their local streets that we had a hard time getting them to zoom back out. So this is Kingstown. This is a city that is based on the very real city of Charleston, South Carolina, which is having threats of sea level rise, but we fictionalized it and embedded threats that were based on the geomorphology of that coast, but we would add in additional things like hospitals in places where we wanted to. So we start off by letting the groups assess the vulnerabilities and risks. For example, you're seeing here in Kingstown, what are the main road arteries that are threatened by flooding? Would you, for example, be prevented from getting to the hospital or be prevented from getting to food? Would a power company be particularly susceptible to flooding under different scenarios? Next slide, please, David. The next step then is to consider diverse stakeholder perspectives. Now, this is not a role-playing game, and so we're not asking the people participating in these deliberations to take on the persona of a stakeholder, but as you'll see in a minute, we are making them consider the perspectives of different stakeholders. And we set these up as a way to represent the idea that people have very different priorities, very different tolerances, very different levels of willingness to act. So these are just two kind of opposite extremes here. An oyster farmer may be absolutely fine with a little bit of additional flooding as long as it is temporary, as long as there's not too much fresh water that kills the shellfish. An ER doctor, on the other hand, may have very, very low tolerance for flooding if their patients are not able to get to the hospital in emergencies. And so they have very different perceptions and priorities. Next slide, please. We then group the solutions into kind of broad categories. And so in this case, again, this is extreme precipitation and sea level, sorry, this is sea level rise, where are you going to keep water out? Are you going to build big seawalls to keep water out? Are you going to adopt strategies for living with water? For example, allowing areas like the bottom floors of parking garages that temporarily flood and build even canals, or are you going to retreat wholesale and move away from the coast? We then kind of gave each of the options different star ratings from an economic, environmental, and social viewpoint, just to kind of help guide the deliberations. Next slide, please. Then what we asked them to do is to take each of those stakeholders, and I think you have them placed on there. Yeah, thanks, David. And ask them from this person's perspective, how much do you think they would be willing to pay, or how supportive do you think they would be from each of these strategies? So one person, for example, may be happy keeping water out. Another one this is for extreme precipitation, may want to adopt a strategy for more green space. In the third strategy we had for extreme precipitation was inform the public. And as you can see, each stakeholder has a different set of priorities and different willingness to pay. Next one, please. Then based on those decisions, and here again, people could bring in their own opinions, but they do have to consider the viewpoints of the stakeholders that they looked at. They have limited resources, so we give them 3 poker chips, and we say, you have enough resources to either do a little bit of each of these 3 groups. So you could put 1 chip each. This is a plan B, which is in the kind of $1 million level, and adopt a little bit of each, or you could do one really big thing, one really big plan A, and then have 1 chip left over that you could even do a plan B for the same thing, or spread it out. So an example here in the upper group, the choice was to invest a lot in the soak it up strategy to have a lot of green infrastructure, and then a smaller campaign for informing the public. And each table then comes to a different conclusion. Next slide. They then submit those, and at the end, we let the different groups present those plans, and they look at the consequences of their choices. We do this using a series of narratives. This is one of my favorite things. We have a series of, this is a slider that David's showing before and after with flooding. We have a series of narrative stories that are based on real stories. We try to have both positive and negative stories. So there are businesses that win awards. There are some instances where schools flood inadvertently. And really what we're trying to point out is, first of all, there's no perfect solution. That one of the questions we get the most often is did we get the right answer? We have to say, well, there is no one right answer. And the other thing is that there are always trade-offs, and that if you're not careful, inevitably the trade-offs end up disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable. And so we let them look at the impacts on the stakeholders and different parts of the community. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to David to talk about the final piece here of how we take the information from the stakeholders and use that for resilience planning.
Thanks so much, Brian. So a really important third element of this, and I thought Brian did a wonderful job of describing how we elicit ideas that are codable and reportable and that we can analyze, is the resilience planning and decision-making step. And this is one of the hardest parts to actually make action in the world, right? But it connects to this whole policy forming piece. And what we do is we try to get the convening institution, which for our project is the Science Center, to consider together with the resilience planners how the ideas and recommendations that are generated by the community scientists can actually help to inform decision making at the local level. And there are a number of ways that we do this. One way is that we actually really try to have the local planners and federal planners too, or state planners, participate in the forums, to directly be there to hear diverse community perspectives. And this is validating to the participants because they know someone is listening and it doesn't just feel like a, an anonymous exercise. If that's not possible, then we try to figure out ways to demonstrate to the participants that the planners are listening. So this is Julie Wormser. Some of you might know that she used to be one of the directors of the Boston Harbor Association and created a lot of the very influential floodplain, flooding maps for the city of Boston, and now is at an organization called the Mystic River Watershed Association. And they helped us get some of the data from our original sea level rise forums into the hands of civic planners, and similarly sort of got the religion of this kind of community engagement so much that she actually helped envision a series of iterative future community science campaigns that we're starting now on urban heat. So the idea is that you sort of cement these partnerships and allow the people who are in a decision-making perspective to talk about how the data are useful from them. In the slide I showed you earlier, where Max from the Museum of Life and Science sort of created this atmosphere of talking among the sort of disparate kind of decision makers and stakeholders in these issues. I thought that was a really great way of doing it during the pandemic time, because it helped encourage people understand that this is a kind of problem, how to adapt to extreme precipitation or drought or flooding in a way that needs your input, because no one has all the answers, and that the answers are thorny and tricky, the way that Brian was talking about. And so this is not a linear process, but rather an iterative cycle that we see. But we do try to take both the data that people recommend as well as that they create through these participatory campaigns through geospatial visualization. So members of Brian's lab and I work together to create this portal that both sort of documents contributions of flooding around our region through a community science campaign, but at the bottom are those little waves, and if you click them, what you end up getting is a document of how the ideas that the participants are creating connects to resilience planning here in Boston and in other similar communities. So I hope that gives you an idea of how we're connecting this idea of community science and deliberation, and we're really looking forward to the discussion. We'll put the relevant links into the chat and email them out if you want, so you can explore and sign up some of these events. There's a whole bunch coming up. We hope you'll come and participate in some of these conversations and in the community science campaigns. Look forward to the conversation.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing about this important partnership. Let's dive into the audience questions. So just as a reminder, if you think of questions for David and Brian, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So I'll get started with one here. How can the act of eliciting ideas and data from community members help resilience planning? Maybe start with Brian on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really at the core of this, right? And so one of our other partners is a cognitive psychologist, John Coley, with whom we work. And in some ways, it's common sense that when people have agency, when they have some control over their own destiny based on their own choices, when they're listened to, they're more likely to adopt solutions and act on that. We've seen it over and over again, if you try to hand something down from above, it never takes. And so I think just from a human nature viewpoint, if we can have people be part of the solution, it's going to stick a lot more. And we've seen this over and over again. I mean, there, for example, marine protected areas, when they are externally imposed, inevitably they fail. But when you have local involvement with people who are involved in enforcement, for example, then they succeed. And it's exactly the same with adaptation strategies. I know, David, I feel like I didn't answer that very well. Do you want to add to that?
I'll add one thing to it. I think what you're talking about is the fact that this can help people sort of feel, both understand the complexity of these policy trade-offs and also be in a better position to understand that their ideas matter. And I think that transition to the other piece of this, which is that there's really important local knowledge that these people have about their communities, right? If you're trying to figure out how to make air quality, better in a community, the people who live in that community know where the hyper local both sort of threats are, but also the possible confounders to a study that might come into the community to try to explore how to do it better. They know these communities. They know where people tend to stop and idle a cement truck, that if you try to design a community science campaign or resilience plan about how to deal with it, might not know. And so, like I said before, I think the public health field and organizations like the Nature Conservancy that do a lot of thinking about where the right places are to put these solutions into place as part of a larger, broader engagement strategy. They knew this already, but I think the important thing here is that for resilience planning, it's if you put the step that Brian talked about at the beginning of getting people's thoughts and ideas about how to conduct both resilience planning and community science campaigns to find out, you're going to get better data and you're going to get better outcomes because it reflects that not only the knowledge of those people, but also their priorities that is sort of a direct application of that knowledge. What they know helps inform what they recommend.
That's a great point. And Alice, if I could just quick jump on, you're absolutely right, David. I do a lot of work overseas and work a lot in the global South. And one of the things you see over and over again are people from countries that are resource limited, that don't have access to the same kind of off-the-shelf technologies we have, are absolutely brilliant at problem solving. I mean, they use what they have. I think in a lot of ways, this is more of a meta view that we fall prey to, kind of depending on technology, and we'll just buy our way out of this. And inevitably technology fails. And so there's some really smart ideas out there to draw from that we can learn from.
So I observed one of the in-person sessions in Boston, I guess a few years ago now, back in the before times when we did things in person. And I was really struck in that session by how easily I felt teams converged on managed retreat as a solution in the fictional or fictionalized locations that they were thinking about. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how to translate that into considering all the potential tools in the real world, because that just seemed like such a powerful result. And there's a national managed retreat conference going on right now, hosted by Columbia, that I'm doing in sort of other parts of the day. And it's just such a fraught conversation, and it was so easy in this context. So how do we get that idea out into the world?
I'll say something about it, and then Brian, you may well have thoughts that might connect with them. You're right, and we actually saw this last night. So we did another sea level Rise Forum last night. It was very different, was online, but similarly, what we saw is that they go in not wanting to do managed retreat. Nobody wants that. And we give them an opportunity to do something that you can't do in the real world, which is we give them a chance to just get a quick sort of dip in the water about what the consequences, not only in terms of flooding, but social and environmental consequences are of possible strategies. So as Brian talked about, we kind of give them a glimpse into the future of what might happen. And it's a mix of both things that we've seen happen in the real world when communities have implemented things, or ideas of what some, sort of long tail strategies may look like in certain situations. And what we found is that, the groups with respect to sea level rise, which is what I think you're asking about, they tend to, want to start with the vegetative solutions and or sort of, hard engineered barriers, some mix of that. Because they value, keeping people where they are, particularly because they care about the priorities and values of those people. But when they find out how hard this can be in some cases, we found that almost all of them embrace some managed retreat solution, whether it's the sort of big wowie one that Brian talked about that has a lot of resources going into it, or the sort of light B version. Almost all of them use some monicum of managed retreat in their solution planning. And I think it shows you that when you're thinking a little bit about what the trade-offs are over time, it gives you a sense of how you can structure these things and think a little bit about how to make that a possibility for some communities. It's a difficult decision, but I too was surprised by how many people embraced it.
Yeah, I can add to this. I mean, so managed retreat or retreat of any kind is horrific, right? And especially if you think of families who've been in an area for generations, or indigenous communities that have been there for millennia, to suddenly abandon the land to which your ancestors have been attached is really horrific. The cases that I've seen where it has been successful are that recognition that you have to maintain the community. And so it's not convincing one person at a time to go. It really is going in and meeting with community leaders and convincing the community that they can maintain some of those connections, even if it is at a new location, rather than trying to convince people one at a time to do that. But yeah, this is going to be one of the hardest things I think we're going to see in coming decades.
I'll say one other thing too, which is that while these kinds of processes can be good for helping to understand, what people tend to think and what sort of priorities there are with respect to a given decision, like should we do this kind of managed retreat? Should we not? Should it look like this? It's also very good for illuminating the how. How should it be done? What are the ways that it can be done most equitably so that people's priorities and ideas are respected and included? So the kind of binary, this is a rubber stamp of getting people's buy-in so that you can say that you've engaged them and they're like a checklist is not really what this kind of process is good for. Of course, we know that there's public input that is mandated in many cases for these kinds of decisions, and it needs to be there. This is more an opportunity to kind of get a sense of, well, you have an opportunity to talk to a bunch of people who represent perspectives of those who will be directly impacted and maybe others who won't, to get a sense of what they would recommend when they think about it. And sometimes we work really hard to try to get people who maybe have never thought about these issues before, not the usual suspects, because they have interesting and creative ideas.
Yeah, managed retreat as a tool for climate adaptation is starting to hit the mainstream. There's a paper out in Science magazine that's tied to this conference that we can share a link for in the materials afterward. It's really a fascinating conversation and very timely. So what has been the response from members of the community, both here in Boston and in other parts of the country, where you've tried to get people engaged, and what has been the biggest barrier to getting community members to engage in these processes?
I'll say two things.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Oh yeah, I would say, first of all, they really appreciate being included. What we found is that, especially for the ones where we could be in a room with them, and I can't wait for those again, you hear from people who maybe signed up because, they had a friend who was participating, or because, we offered a gift card and they did this instead of something else they might have done to, sort of do something for the day. They really appreciate the idea that they're decision makers listening to what they have to say. And for a lot of these places, science museums are like, they're kind of like, they're not universities, but they think of them as places of learning, and they don't necessarily see themselves as people who can contribute important knowledge. And the idea that resilience planners want to hear what they have to say is important. And I think we've seen that. In terms of the biggest barrier, I think during COVID, it's been people's time. A lot of people are very difficult. And so, we're wondering with these virtual ones that started last week, how do we get beyond the usual suspects who are already thinking about these issues? Unfortunately, we see the greatest drop off among those communities that we have to work the hardest to get to the table because of that. So, we often pay people to come and participate so that they have, the support of being able to get a babysitter or transportation help to come or what have you. And I think the digital divide has exacerbated that. So I'm excited to be able to do these again in person, but also grateful for the museums that are putting these on either virtually in their local community or a few of them are doing it in person. And we didn't know if that was going to be possible, but I can't wait to do that again. And I think there's kind of this hybrid model where we're able to connect people who are, in similar situations across space, and there's amazing learning for that. And the visualizations have been incredibly powerful for that. And as Brian said, if it wasn't for the story maps, I don't know how we would have done this during a time that we couldn't get people together except in the venue that we're in now. But there also is kind of a special power of just being on a team. You called them a team, Allison, a group of people who have just kind of for a day been given the task of sort of an advisory committee for people who do this every day. And they take it quite seriously.
I can just quickly add, the other approach we've used, which is much smaller scale, is to try to build in these deliberations into other existing groups. And so, we've done it at sustainability fairs. We've worked with Girls Inc. in Lynn with their participants. We've gone to church groups. And so it's usually much smaller groups of people, but because it's part of something they already had planned and they have the logistics handled, we're able to do it that way, but nothing on the same scale as what we've done at the Museum of Science.
I'll say one other thing too that reminds me of, Brian, which is that when people do spend a day or several hours doing this, they always ask us, what else can I do? How can I participate? How can I be part of this? And that's where we brought in these community science, participatory science activities, because we saw, okay, you have this mind on resilience planning, and a lot of times what we wish we knew was better understanding of local vulnerabilities for communities and marginalized populations. And a way to do that is to get out there and help document how it happens. So when there's a king tide, which are the places that are flooding, not just the ones that you see on the news every year, which are the obvious ones, but maybe the ones that are in neighborhoods where people, have not been documenting them. How can you help to understand where, a small solution like planting a small blank of trees or even bushes or a water feature could help a community? By thinking about these from a policy perspective, our idea of this science to civics idea is that you can bring forward people to contribute their local knowledge, their understanding of their communities, and also their recommendations.
So you started to touch on, I think, what may be some elements of the answer. So I'll follow on with what needs to happen for this kind of participatory resilience planning to be as inclusive and as equitable as it can be. And whoever wants to pick that one up.
Sorry, I was answering a question in the chat. So the question is how to become inclusive and equitable. I think the first thing is to listen. So I probably should have been listening rather than typing. Yeah, I think David covered a lot of it. I think a lot of it is the recognition that there are a lot of brains out there that are not being used, and respecting that, this is not, it's not an instance of just being equitable in terms of checking boxes to make sure that people hear it, but really genuinely wanting to incorporate that knowledge and that lived experience into the solutions. And a big part of that from the science perspective is designing science that is open to those changes. That for so long we went into this thinking, we know how to set up experiments, we know what the product should be, and then it's just a matter of educating people that starting off with listening sessions, starting off with those understandings of the local scale before we start doing anything is the way to really get that genuine involvement. David, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, two things. One is about trust. You just got towards the idea of building trust and having people understand, the parameters and the people explicitly can value the local knowledge and ideas. And I think that gets to partnerships. So I know I already mentioned the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina twice, and now I see that Max is actually on the call. So he's probably been like telling us all sorts of knowledge. But it's been amazing to see how they started doing these discussions with local partners and now are doing it on all sorts of topics, such as, people who are experiencing the, temporary crisis of homelessness and other kinds of things. So you start with a conversation about one thing and it helps to build trust and understanding about what the priority is and how these different issues intersect with, social disparities and really doing that. That gets to the second point, which is, and we don't know the right answer to this. What is the right balance between local and global? Brian talked a little bit about the fact that, we and others, like I know the Gulf of Maine Research Institute has done a lot of these kinds of activities on flooding, and immediately everybody wants to know what happens to their grandmother's house, what happens to my school, and it's hard sometimes to get them to think as like, a community member or somebody who has to make a decision for an entire community in the face of very real vulnerabilities. So we have this kind of anonymized real place approach with the idea of bringing in locally focused resilience planning questions that connect to it. But we also have colleagues like Jeremy Hoffman at the Science Museum of Virginia, who has a subsequent NOAA grant to take this model and do it based on the hyper-local vulnerability assessments that he and others have been leading with community participation. And there's real power in that. So what is the right mix between local and sort of regional, global, and also, thinking a little bit about strategies that other places have put into place, so you can think about the trade-offs of those strategies and bringing case studies so we can learn from around the world, but then also going back to the very real history and legacy of disparities in a community, because if you don't acknowledge those, I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes these stakeholder exercises can be inauthentic, and we're trying to think about how to do that in a way that both respects what we've learned and uses the knowledge of others who are doing this kind of work.
So Linda Clark asks, how can a group reach out to you to do a presentation? My church's environmental justice team would likely be interested in sponsoring one. Can people hire you?
That's actually what I was typing was my email address in the chat. So if you're able to send out to everybody, feel free to share my email. David, it's up to you whether you want to share yours with everyone, and feel free to contact one of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll also say, though, that I think it would be wonderful, for you to sign up and participate in one of these. We happen to have every Wednesday for the next 3 a forum on, one hazard. And so if you go to this page, you can scroll down and see these climate hazard resilience forums, and members of Brian's lab and our partners around the country will be facilitating these at some of the locations that you saw on that map. I think drought is next week, and then extreme precipitation and heat happen in successive weeks after that. And they feature, participation from NOAA and from resilience planners. In some cases, we have like somebody from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation to talk about drought, and Jeremy to talk about heat. And then another, all of them have that, but then you'll also meet people from communities around the country that are grappling with this. and it can give you a sense of how you might be able to use and leverage these. The reason I'm mentioning this is that you all paid for this work. It was funded by the government. And so all of these materials are downloadable and usable. While we'd be happy to facilitate something, we also can point you to where you could download and use them themselves. Both Brian and I are pretty passionate about the idea that government funded science should be given back to the people. And so we encourage you to use them, and I'll put a link to how you could download them yourself.
Awesome. Well, sadly, we're approaching the end of our time today. So I'll offer both of you the opportunity to share any final thoughts. Whoever wants to go first.
You want to go first, Brian?
I'm not sure I have final thoughts. This has been a great discussion. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, I think it's been great. And you know, I guess I'd say we have looked to the Nature Conservancy a number of times because one of the things that Brian showed when he talked about the change from that, you know, kind of forklift philosophy where you just come and dump knowledge on a community toward this kind of multi-directional learning and public engagement is in the decision support area. Decision support is an area where everyone knows that a decision is better when it includes the perspectives and values and ideas of an engaged community. And so you look at this, you know, coastal decision support tools that the Nature Conservancy has created in partnership with others. And I think that's what's needed, this kind of participatory planning. So we certainly hope we can work together on it. We've got lots of federal proposals in with the Nature Conservancy, but we think that this is the kind of work that needs to be done, both sort of like across the world, but you know, in that hyper local settings, and we would love to be part of that.
Great.
What he said.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes all of this work possible. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today and a recording of this webinar. If you're enjoying our webinars, please share them with your friends. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram. You can follow me on Twitter at Allison_Bowden to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. As always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. Join us on July 8th for a Nature Connects webinar about how the Nature Conservancy in Arizona and Friends of the Verde River have worked together in the Verde watershed for more than a decade and have recently developed a unique scoring system that provides an overall assessment of the health of the watershed. We'll discuss the goal of this new scoring system and how it can be used to improve the health of the Verde watershed now and into the future. Don't miss it. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.